Paul ends up in Athens, and he does what he always does. He goes on ahead of actually Silas and Timothy and sends word to them to come and join him as soon as possible. And he goes to the synagogue and he reasons with the Jewish population there and tells them about his experience on the road to Damascus with Jesus. He tells them that Jesus is the promised hope of Israel that God had been telling them about for millennia. And after he's done all his reasoning with the Jewish population that he could do, and he's made about as much headway as he can, he moves out into the Greek marketplaces and he begins to share in conversation with those who are willing to discuss with them. Now, in Athens, more than any other location, the people would have seen philosophical ideas and sharing of these different concepts as something that wasn't just done in the academic realm or out there somewhere, but really was also done on the streets and over a meal and among just common people. And so it would not have been weird for Paul to have discussions with anybody that he came across within the marketplace and shared a meal with or invited out to have a drink with him or whatever else. And so as he discussed with them about Jesus, and specifically the anastasis, which in the Greek term is the Greek word for resurrection, he would have been sharing a lot about this Jewish God that he believed in. And yet the terms Jesus, Jesus in the Greek, and anastasis would have kind of been stirred up and been rumored about. And so the highest authorities of the land, those philosophers who sat in the court of the Areopagus and the Mars Hill, would have heard about this and immediately begun to think that there's this strange Jewish man who has arrived in town and was trying to bring in a new foreign divinity. Not just a single divinity, but they would have heard the words Jesus and anastasis, and even though they knew the Greek term of resurrection, they would have thought maybe that Paul was referring to a male and female divine divinity set, a god and goddess that Paul was bringing from some foreign land. And in their minds, they would have wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be this intrusion of something that wasn't acceptable and wasn't a part of Athenian life into their city that would infiltrate and begin to undermine all the things that they believed with the common people. So they wanted to hear out Paul, so they invite him to come up to the Areopagus. Now, I already said that this is the highest court of the land. This is something we often miss, and I actually was really surprised about it. I don't think I ever heard about this before reading and looking at N.T. Wright's work, that this was actually a court. They would try murderers or other criminals here, and they would decide their fates. And so this was a court. This was not just a place where philosophers sat and just contemplated things up on the hill, but this was actually where they decided between different crimes, and they decided people's fates. And it was written into their charter as something that came from an ancient writer who wrote a play where actually the god of the underworld had said that in death there would be no resurrection, there would be no anastasis. So Paul is invited to this place, and he's doing more than just sharing the gospel in friendly conversation with other philosophers, other theologians, but instead Paul is really defending his way of thinking and his right to come into the city and to teach about what he found to be the hope of the world in Jesus Christ. And so when Paul's sharing his faith here, he's bringing a very Jewish message. And even though he connects in with where these philosophers and teachers and authorities would have been found a natural place with the unknown God and with the poets that he quotes, at the same time, he's not teaching things that would have been accepted very widely by either of the major groups who held authority there, the Epicureans and the Stoics. He kind of finds a bridge. He talks in ways that can be somewhat acceptable to each, but also talks in ways that each would reject. And in the end, when he finally talks about the resurrection of the dead, they all begin to laugh, because for both of those philosophies, being raised from the dead back into a material body would make no sense at all. And so they laughed him out of the court, although some there did believe, and they asked Paul to come back and to talk to them in some other setting and share with them. But Paul, sensing that the atmosphere was not very friendly to him at the moment, decides that he's going to move on. And so he heads further southwest into the region of Corinth. And so Corinth sits on a little isthmus that's between Greece and where Corinth leads into. And this is the only place where you can bring a ship and you can get over the sea or get over land to the other side of the sea without sailing around the treacherous waters that you would go around if you went further south and west. And so a lot of people would port here, and they would have their ships actually taken out of the water and dragged across the land, or they would have their goods taken out of their ships and transported to another ship on the other side. And while they were there in the city, they would enjoy all the things that Corinth had to offer. And being a place, a port place, they would have had things that you wouldn't have found in any other city, and all kinds of entertainments and things. And so it would have almost kind of been like a Las Vegas, where whatever you do there and whatever you enjoy there is kind of a unique experience. And they had a giant temple to Aphrodite, and it was espoused that this temple had 1,000 prostitutes by one ancient writer. Now that's probably not true. There wasn't really much space to service that kind of business or those kind of numbers of prostitutes, but at the same time, this is the reputation that Corinth had gained. Paul spends a tremendous amount of time in Corinth. Once again, we see him have some kind of success because he stays here. He stays probably about 3 years in Corinth, and we don't see him stay that long anywhere else. The next longest place might have been in Ephesus, where he spent a significant amount of time after he leaves Corinth. But we see that he spends a tremendous amount of time in Corinth. He comes back even later on his third missionary journey after he goes through Ephesus and then back up through Macedonia and in Greece. He comes back to Corinth, and he really invests in this place. He really trains and teaches the leaders and the elders there. But it's also the place that we see him writing to the most in the collections that we have. We have 2 letters, but we know that he probably wrote at least 4 or 5 total in references in those 2 letters. And so Paul really invested in the people there, and he really saw this as one of his major kind of projects, was to bring this church along to maturity. And yet it was also the place where he had some of the most difficult challenges in bringing the people along in maturity in the faith, and probably because of all the societal pressures that they were around. After this, Paul leaves, and like I said, he sails across the Aegean Sea and he stops in Ephesus. We'll see that in our next video. But we really learn and see Paul's willingness to stretch himself out and to speak to people who wouldn't have understood his Jewish way of thinking at all, and yet try to translate it into language that they would understand so that they could hear the gospel and they too could come to know Jesus as their Savior.